Hello and welcome to Visual Studio Bytes. In the previous session we saw how we can use Visual Studio 2010 to create a web performance test. And now that you have a web performance test, what's next? Well, creating the web performance test was the first step towards load testing your application. Now that we have the base test, we can test the page behavior when end users access the page. But before that, have you ever had the head of business call you and mention that the marketing team has done a fantastic job and are expecting increased traffic on the website? Can the website survive this weekend with that additional load? This probably is the perfect opportunity to capacity test your application to see how your website holds up under various levels of load. Then you can work the results backward to see how much hardware you may need to scale up your application to survive the weekend. Apart from that, it is always a good idea to have some benchmarks around how the application performs under light load for short duration, under heavy load for long duration, and maybe soak test the application, run a constant load for a week or 2 weeks to record the effects of constant load for really long durations. This is a great way of identifying how your application handles the default Iist application pool reset, which by default is configured to once in every 25 hours. And these benchmarks will act as perfect yardsticks to measure performance gains when you start making improvements. But before we jump into recording the load test, it's important that I mention that there are some best practices around load testing. The load testing really should be a goal-based load testing approach. Now, if we look at this slide, um, since the subject is vast and there are a lot of things to measure and analyze, it is very easy to get distracted from the real goal. You can optimize your application once you know where the pain points are. There is no point performance testing or load testing with 5,000 users if your intranet application will only have around 100 simultaneous users in real time in production. It is important to keep focused on the real goals of the project. So the idea is to have a user story around your load testing scenarios and test realistically. So if you look at this slide, it's important that you identify the objectives, identify the key scenarios, identify how much workload do you expect on your website, put together some metrics that you want to report against or that may be important for you to make performance improvements. Some metrics like pages per second or the queue or if there are any locks, and there's a whole list of perfmon counters you can go through and identify the ones that are important for you. And then start creating test cases and then simulate load and analyze the results. This is really an iterative process, so keep going back to identifying objectives and following this entire chain. Try and refine your tests. Well, an important thing I'd like to add here is if your application is already deployed in production, then you can make use of the Iist Logs to understand the user behavior. The Iist Logs allow you to record events for each application and website on the web server. You can create separate logs for each of your applications and websites. Logging information in Iist really goes beyond the event logging or performance monitoring features. Um, the Iist logs can include information such as who visited your website, what the visitor viewed, when was the information last viewed, whether there was an attempt to perform an unauthorized access to some portion, and then it really gives you a rich sense of how the user is using your website. What's the user behavior on your website? Probably for those ninjas who are already using the Iist logs, which by default are configured on your Iist server, you should probably use log parser, which is a utility which comes with your Windows Iist tools, which lets you query your Iist logs in a SQL-like manner without having to probably export them into an Excel or an XML. And if you didn't want to use log parser, you could download a free web analyzer tool from the internet as well. Now that we know what the different type of load testings, different type of load testing, and the best approach for performing load testing, I think we're a good spot to start the demo on load testing. Right, so let me open up Visual Studio. This is the web performance test we recorded in the last scenario, where I loaded the next.co.in website. I logged in as a user, entered the credential, um, searched for a product, and then added that product to my basket. This is again a data-driven test, but this is the perfect base for us to create our load test with. So I'm going to come in here, right-click the test project, select Add, New Test, and load test. So let's call this login add to basket next website dot load test. Press OK. Now a wizard, that must be good. So a wizard pops up, and if I click next, I get the option of what what kind of think times do I want to introduce in my web performance in my load test. Now by default, when we recorded the web performance test, um, we were really clicking through. A user, when they're browsing a website or making a purchase, there will be intermediate gaps between browsing two different products or adding a product to a basket, because the user is thinking, right? So if you wanted to mimic that in the actual load test, you have the option of configuring that from here. If you select do not use think times, then whatever the actions, they will be played back as quick as possible. But I would encourage you to use introduce some think time, so that you can really mimic how a user in real time would be using your application. So let's add a think time of 2 seconds between every action that the user performs. I guess in real time really depends on your website. It would be more than 2 seconds, or sometimes might not be required at all. Press next. Now this is really cool, right? You can either start the website with a constant load of 25 users, but think of it this way: if your marketing team has done a good job and then they're spreading this awareness through an advertisement campaign over the internet, as as users see that advertisement, they would probably come into your website. Not all the users would come in at the same time. So if you wanted to mimic that scenario, you could use the step load technique, where you say that start the load test with 10 users, and then after every 10 seconds, add 10 more users to the website till you reach a maximum capacity of 250 users. Now, this is probably a good point to mention here, that if you have Visual Studio Ultimate through the MSDN license, then you're entitled to a load testing feature pack as well. Now, this feature pack will allow you to run your load test with unlimited users, so you wouldn't be restricted to just 250 users. And the other thing is, when you install that feature pack on your machine, when the load test runs, it's not restricted to just using one core on the processor. With that feature pack installed, you can unlock the potential to use all the cores on your processor, giving you the opportunity to really mimic what would be happening on your production server when the user does this activity. Let's press next. Now I can really have a test mix because I only have one test to run. I can't really demo this, but if you had like 5 tests and you really wanted to break the number of users and the number of tests run, then you have the option of specifying that from here. Press next. Let's add the test we want to load test, log in and add to the basket. Press here, click OK. Now if I had multiple tests here, let me add this test here as well. Press OK. So now that I have multiple tests, I can really define the distribution. So I would expect that 80% of the users would come to my website, and maybe just 10% of them would log in, or maybe just 5% of them would actually end up adding something to the basket. So you could put your tests in sequence here, and assign them a distribution of run what test to what percent, and the other test to what percent. For now, I'm gonna get rid of the other test and only run the login and add to basket test. Press next. Now if you wanted to mimic the network types that you expect the users to be logged in with, like for instance LAN, but not all your users will be accessing the application through LAN. Some might be accessing through a 56K modem or slow connection, or maybe a cable DSL connection. So you have the option of assigning a distribution of what network types would the user be running the test from as well. Click next. Now, not all your users would be using IE7. Some of them might be using Chrome or Firefox. So you have the option of again, breaking that down and testing that as well. Press next. Um, so I want to collect the the application logs, the ASP.NET logs, the .NET logs, and the IIS and the SQL logs from this server when the test is run. So I'm gonna press next. But before that, if you had multiple agents, or if you wanted to collect the uh, some of the logs from some server and some of the other logs from the other server, then you can specify that here as well. In addition to that, you also have the option of enabling certain features from the test settings file, which I'll show you later. Press next. Now this is an important screen. The load test duration really depends how long you want to run the load test for. In my case, I'm going to run the test for 3 minutes. You can specify a warm-up duration, so when you start the application you haven't probably cached the pages, or it takes a certain bit of time before your web server really warms up, so you could specify maybe a 30-second here, and it's only after that that the counters would start picking up and accumulating the data from the server. The sampling rate again is set up by default to 5 seconds. Um, this is an important thing here, the validation level. Remember in the last session where I showed you that we could add custom validations, we had associated some of the validations to high, which means if I select high here, then all the custom validations I had set up would be run. But do I really need to run all those custom validations when I'm doing a load test? Maybe I would want to run those validations when I'm doing a web performance test, but when I'm doing a load test, I'm more interested to see how my page how whether my page can sustain that load, rather than checking if the page has that tag or that tag, because that's already tested in the web performance test. So I would probably want to choose low here so that I perform minimum level of validation and focus my maximum attention on the page under load. How does that behave, rather than performing individual validation checks. Click finish. Now this really draws a nice hierarchical graph for you, showing you the basic scenarios that you have selected along with the counter sets. Now by default all the perfmon counters are added for me here, and if you see, Microsoft does this fantastic job of adding certain threshold numbers against these counters. So if you look at the percentage idle and press F4, if you press the compare constant and press F4, you see that Microsoft assesses that if you have a counter of, if you have more than 20, if you have 20, then this is critical, right? So they've gone ahead and assigned some threshold rules against these perf counters. So rather than you having to worrying and assessing these numbers individually to see whether you've met the threshold or you're below the threshold, there's some default thresholds already assigned to help you in your analysis of the results. You have the opportunity to go in and modify these numbers or add your own thresholds, but a groundwork has already been done for you. You can again come in and right click the counter sets and add your own custom counters if you want to perform or track other counter sets apart from the ones that are loaded for you by default. um, if I right click the run settings and click properties, I can see pretty much everything that I configured while I was going through the wizard. Some things that are missing from the wizard that you can set up here directly is the SQL tracing. So if you wanted to set up a tracing session against your SQL, then you can do that from here. Apart from that, like warm up time, there is a cooldown time as well. So once the 3-minute clock is reached, all the tests are abandoned, but you probably want to give a 30-second window where the tests ramp down. If there is any transaction, you give the test the opportunity to complete that transaction, complete that little job that it was doing. So I think we've done the basic settings, and we're at a point where we've set up our load test. I think it's a good spot for us to trigger the load test and start observing the results. All right, so I'm gonna press play to run the load test, and this loads up the analyzer, which starts to show the results as the test is being run in real time. Now, the analyzer lets you review the results in three ways. One is monitor a running load test. So a condensed set of performance counter data is maintained in memory. To prevent the results memory requirements from growing unbounded, up to 200 samples for each performance counter are maintained. This includes 100 evenly spaced samples that span the current elapsed time of the run and the most recent 100 samples as well. After the load test run is completed, these results are stored in the database, and a round of analysis is performed, and then the results are rendered from the database. And the third option really is in the analyzer to compare two test runs. Now our test run is really halfway through. If I load the website www.next.co.in, I can see that the website's really under stress. See, it's still not loaded. It's still partially loaded. The behavior is really slow. So the test is really taking a toll on the website. It loads. It's still loading. So it took a good 40-50 seconds to load the page for the user. If we go back to the results screen, we can see that the counters and the values in real time. So I can see the pages per second. I can see that the website is just doing around 1.95 pages per second. That's really less. It's taking around whoa 18 seconds. That's the average page time. There you go. So the home page is taking around 47 seconds on an average to render. Well, that's not very impressive, is it? And then you see all these other metrics as well. So for the purpose of demo, I will press stop. So it's at this point it's taking all these numbers down to the database, um, writing the results to the repository, and then it will reload the results from the database. There you go, reading counters from the database, and these are loaded. So first, when the test finishes, I get this summary page where I can see crisp level of details. So our test reached a maximum user load of 150 users. We were only doing about 2 pages per second. The request per second, the number of failed requests, and I can see that it for the 95% of the requests it took around 134 seconds to bring up the home page. So really a crisp level overview of what the test run statistics were. I can go to the graphs level where I can see that there's a warning sign, so I can expand this, expand this, and I can see that there's a current queue length which has violated the threshold, and hence I get the warning message. I can say show counter on graph, and this gets added here for me. Now I can right click and go to the user detail where I can see this graphical view, which tells me what the test was doing at a very specific moment in time. I can see all the details of what the test was, and at each, so it really becomes easier for you to track. I could focus on a specific time in the test by condensing the view, or I could expand the view to see the overall test run details as well. I can press close, so I haven't lost the results. I can always come back and say um, open and manage results, which shows me the test run details. I can click open, right, and I can go back to the tabular view where I can see the numbers that are used to generate that graph, go back to the graphs view, and maybe if I just wanted to see one graph, I could click one panel. Maybe if I wanted to see all the graphs, I could click 4 panels. Now maybe I have the results now and I wanted to generate a report. I can click on the create Excel report icon here, and this brings up Excel, where I have the opportunity to create a report. I press next. It allows me to create a run comparison report or a trend report. If I choose the run comparison report, then I will get all the tests that I've run. Report name, log in and add to basket. Yeah. I've only run one test, but if I had multiple tests, then I can select multiple tests. Maybe one of them is my baseline and one of them is the most recent test, which has been run after certain improvements have been made, so we can perform a comparison between the two to see if we only have one test. Well, anyways, yeah, to perform a comparison to see if there's been any improvement with the performance tweaks that have been made. So let's select this, click next. Now, which counters do I want to select in my test? Let's select all of them and press finish. So around 15 pages worth of report is automatically generated for me. It's a very useful index page. I can click on the average page time, takes me here. I can see all the numbers that were used to generate this graph, so really get the details. Can go back, select some of the other numbers I'm interested in. So quite easy, right? You get this nice report. You can use that report to present to the management as well, rather than you having to individually manually create the reports. And since all the database is stored in SQL, you can yourself write some queries to generate custom reports as well. So I'll close the report now and come back to the test. So this was really a basic test to show you how to load test an application. We recorded the web performance test in the last session. We went through the wizard to see what options do we have to configure the load test. We chose a certain scenario that we wanted to test. We applied the workload, we looked at the results, and we looked at how we can export the results to Excel.